Are you a parent who is 0 to 6 months in to lowering demands and changing your parenting with a PDA child or teen? If so, this live and this podcast episode is for you. Today, we're going to talk about the messiness of changing your parenting and caregiving. And I want to normalize this and give examples from my own life. Hopefully they'll be a little bit humorous and light because I'm reflecting back on what we went through and how messy and chaotic it was. And this topic came up yesterday in the Paradigm Shift program because one of the parents asked a really good question, which was, my daughter has never actually reached burnout. She sort of hovers around her threshold of tolerance for nervous system activation, but has never gone into full burnout. So does the framework of burnout, recovery, and equilibrium apply to our family? And I loved this question because it gave us an opportunity to reframe a part of this process for parents that I've experienced myself as a mom of a PDAer and also witnessed in now over 1,000 parents that I've worked with either in coaching or the Paradigm Shift. So we sort of reframed it as, burnout is usually the point at which parents recognize that their child is not just having behavioral problems that can be modified by behavioral techniques, right? Because it starts to impact their access to basic needs, and we start to see the behavioral expression of the disability that isn't just, quote, defiance, but it's actually like fight, flight, feral animal, or total shutdown, which is nervous system driven. So even if your child hasn't reached burnout, many of you have reached that point of realization where it's like, oh, something has to change. Like we are hitting rock bottom here and this is not sustainable. So even if your child didn't hit that point, many parents hit that point. So that's when we reevaluate everything, right? The status quo, how we've been parenting, the decisions we're making, how we are with our child, etc. And then the analog to sort of the recovery, if we're looking at the burnout recovery equilibrium cycle in the family system, the recovery period is actually one of relearning your child, lots of experimentation and trial and error, and it's super messy because you're changing everything, right? You're changing the way that you speak to your child. You're changing the logic of how you understand parenting and behavior and education and therapy. You're basically learning a new language of how to communicate non-verbally with your body and your expressions and your tone to signal nervous system safety. You might actually be learning a new way to use language, for example, using declarative language. So this is a time period that lasts more than a day or two, right? It's, I would say it on average, it would last 6 to 12 months where you're in this period of figuring things out and feeling awkward and feeling like you don't know if things are going to turn out the way that you want them to. You're also, if you're lowering demands and lowering boundaries and limits, you're going to have that feeling of like, if I give this child an inch, they're going to take 10,000 miles and do 2 trips around the moon, because you might have felt that you've been holding back their nature with boundaries and routine and structure and rules, and that any chink in that dam or that armor is just going to be a tsunami of chaos over you. So if you're listening to this as a podcast, feel free to reflect on this. If you're here with me live, feel free to drop a heart or an emoji if this is resonating for you. I hope it is, because this has definitely been my experience. It was not like a linear, smooth path where everything just like chugged along A to B to C to D. It was very much ebbs and flows, back and forth, chaos and uncertainty. And then in the same way, children or teens eventually reach their equilibrium or more stability in their nervous system and a window of tolerance. Family systems can also reach an equilibrium, but it's only by going through this messiness that we get there, okay? So what do I mean by an equilibrium in a family system. It means we're making decisions in a different way. It means we're operating from a different logic. It means we're practicing a new way of being. So just like any other learning, like if you're getting a new degree, if you're moving to a foreign country, you're learning a new language, anything, it's going to be awkward and messy, and there will be some funny stories along the way where you're like, holy moly, I can't believe we did that, or I can't believe that happened. So I want to normalize this, and to do so, I'm going to share 5 stories from my personal life with my child, my PDA son, who's now almost 10. But when we really started this practice was around the age of 4.5. So I have many moments of chaos and uncertainty and feeling awkward, and we're going to start with 5 of those stories. So one is going to be about declarative language, one about lowering demands and introducing new novel things for dopamine, going back to a school environment or camp after being outside of that for a period of time, 4, supporting a special interest, and then finally getting my child sensory input while needing to do it in a low demand way and what this looked like. Okay, so let's start with declarative language. So for those of you who are new to this page, declarative language is simply, instead of asking your child direct questions like, how was your day? Do you want apples for breakfast? Did you feed the dog, etc.? Or imperatives, get your backpack for school, put on your shoes, eat your apples, feed the dog. We're using a type of language that doesn't set off their threat response as much because it's open-ended and it's more of a declarative statement like, I see you have apples still on your plate. And then the child can decide or not if they eat the apple. Or, I noticed the dog hasn't eaten their breakfast yet, or their bowl is empty, right? So it's a totally different way of speaking. It really is. And I remember when I first read Linda K. Murphy's Declarative Language Handbook, which was over 5 years ago now, highly recommend. I was like, okay, I'm all in. I'm going to totally do this declarative language thing. But that's not how I naturally speak. I don't just say statements and leave them hanging in the atmosphere and see if anyone responds. It's not, for me, a natural way of interacting. So I would often, be about to ask a question or about to ask my PDA son to do something, or even say hey, it's time to go, in an imperative way. And then I would catch myself and in my head be like, oh, that's a direct question, or oh, that is an imperative. That's not how I'm supposed to be speaking to my PDA son. And then I would remember what I learned in the book, and then the gears would shift in my head, and then I would try and formulate the sentence. But often I would just stand there like a doofus, in front of my son being or say one word or sentence that didn't make any sense. And he would just look at me like, what is wrong with you, Mom? Why can't you speak? And this happened a lot, right? I don't know if this has happened for any of you. Feel free to indicate if this is resonating, but for me, changing the way I spoke to my son and also paying attention to am I smiling? Are my eyes kind? What's my tone? Am I below my child? It was an extraordinarily difficult and messy process, just like the same thing when I learned to speak Spanish in a foreign country. When I was immersed in a foreign country, I would make silly mistakes. I would be exhausted. I wouldn't know what to say. I would sometimes just open my mouth and nothing would come out. So with a lot of practice and compassion for myself and messiness, then I started saying it. I just started using it more naturally. But I had totally shifted the pendulum to where it was the only way I spoke. And often I would have those same awkward moments with the receiver of the language, the declarative language, from a person who is not PDA or didn't need that language accommodation. And they would just be like, what is happening? So for example, when I was really like well practiced and it was going well and I was like totally on board with declarative language and I could actually say it, I remember sometimes I would go over to my sister's house who lives nearby, and I have 2 nieces and a nephew. And I would just naturally speak using declarative language because in my brain I was like, oh, I don't want to ask my nephew direct questions like, how's basketball or how's baseball? And I remember after one visit, he told his mom, why does Aunt Casey talk to me like that? Can you tell her not to? Right? Because he was just like, this is such a strange way of speaking, right? And then another funny little anecdote is like, now it's so ingrained in me, I often use it with people besides my son without even realizing it. And so I remember I was doing a podcast interview in the last year, and I wanted my husband to help me set up the technology and like make sure the microphones were good. And I kept saying like, I have an interview at 12:30, right? Thinking that like he would remember that his job is to help me set up with the technology. But like, it was like 12:22 and I was like, Jake, why aren't you helping me set up the like microphone? And he's like, you never asked me to, like, what are you talking about? And I realized like, oh, I used declarative language with him, but it didn't register because he and I communicate in a much more direct way. So it is awkward, it is messy, it can be like you don't know how to use it at all, you practice intensively with your PDAer, and then you're only speaking like that, and people are like, what are you doing? So that's my first story about declarative language. The next story happened when we were really leaning into the concepts of lowering demands and not having as much boundaries around things we would normally have, because we were reevaluating, okay, when do we actually have to say no? When do we actually have to put limits for safety and health and well-being versus just like not wanting things to get messy or disordered or chaotic, right? And I was also trying to change my relationship with my son where there was more humor and playfulness and fun. And so it was a real push for me to do that because I felt so tight and so anxious and like really wanted structure for my brain. That's like my access need, is like things to be orderly, right? But I remember the boys taking a bath, and at the time I had 2 friends from Colombia who were living with us to help me sort of like get myself out of burnout and sometimes help with the kids. And they were trying to give my son a bath, and I had told them like, let's lower the demands. Like if they want to put cooking things in the bath, if they want to put food coloring in the bath, if they want to use daddy's shaving cream, like it's all good. Like let's just have fun and not worry about it. And I remember, I think I was trying to like cook nearby while they were in the bathroom right next to us. And my son just kept insisting on more and more bubbles and more water. And like, I could see they were like sort of splashing things over into the bathroom. And of course my instinct was like, you're getting everything wet. Like this is so chaotic. But I was like really working on like not setting limits that I didn't have to. But then ultimately, like, I just remember this moment where I looked up and it was like the entire bathroom was flooded and part of the kitchen was flooded. And it was like, I was like, oh no, like this is an unsafe situation. And then my PDAer was just like so hyperactive and constantly in manic motion. So he like ran, luckily he didn't slip, but he ran through the water with his towel. And then his little brother, who was only like 2 at the time, came running through too and just like skidded naked across all of this water in the kitchen. And I remember just being like, oh my gosh, I'm such a terrible mom. Like I'm trying to do this, but like I'm hurting my baby because he's like slipping on the water. And I remember that moment of being like, I'm trying to lower demands and I'm trying not to set boundaries that I don't need to, but like, look what happened, right? So it's like, it's this very messy experimentation as we're trying to learn how to do this. And I'm included in that, okay? So then, you know, when we tell stories over long timelines, it can seem like easy peasy, right? Like, okay, this happened. They were out of school for like a year and a half, and then they went back to school. Or like, you know, they sort of couldn't access public school, so then we found a private school, like done and done. But I want to just tell you a little bit more about the messiness of going back to a school environment after being home during COVID for like over a year. And, you know, he would go 2 hours a couple times a week to this co-op preschool where I was there and my sister was there, and it was like he could get that special interest of other kids, but it wasn't like kindergarten, because he couldn't access kindergarten. That was online, and then it was like very chaotic, some days on, some days off. And then when he went back to school, public school in the fall, like he just refused and couldn't access it. So I was at the point that many of you will reach or have reached or did reach, which is like the cost of pushing him to go to school is so much for his nervous system that he's starting to go back into burnout. He's not eating. He's having panic attacks every night. This isn't going to work, right? After a year and a half of advocacy and like having a service dog that they didn't want to come to school, all the things, right? So we were trying out a school environment at a private school, and I remember I asked the school if I could sit outside his classroom for the entire day so that if he needed me, he could come get me. And so I could observe what was happening, because I wasn't sure if it was going to work and if we were going to need to continue to unschool. And I remember sitting outside the classroom and people just like walking by, and I was just sitting there for like the entire day, for days and days. And then I finally started to feel comfortable enough for me to go home, right? But, you know, I gave the teachers my phone number and I was like, it's all good. And I remember that I had just started coaching, right? Like just started coaching. And I remember I was on a coaching call and I missed a call. And keep in mind, like I was working very, very specific time periods. It's not like I had full-time work or anything. I was just trying to like eke out pockets of time where I could actually feel like I was making a contribution and it was intellectually stimulating, etc., because I had left my career. And I remember I got off the call and I had messages and was told that he had smashed into a rock wall because he was doing his sensory seeking and activation. He wasn't like having a panic attack, but he was just in that manic space, and he ran directly into a climbing wall. And so it turns out he broke 2 ribs and a collarbone the second week in his private school and had to be home for 10 days, right? So of course I'm like, oh my gosh, I just started like this very small coaching practice, and you know, the first day of the second week, I'm like in the ER for 5 days and not knowing if it's too activating for him to go back to school, right? And so all we can do in those moments is like take it one day at a time. And so reflecting back, you know, where I am now, it's like, yeah, I have a business and I work much more, but at that decision point, I had no idea how things were going to turn out, right? There's a lot of uncertainty and messiness. And then when he had his service dog, his second year, I remember my husband and I had to take shifts again, sitting outside the classroom, this time 3 to 4 hours a day for 3 months, every day, in order to support the training of the service dog and take him out to go poop and pick up his poop. So like, yes, my son was in school, but like so were my husband and I, right? And so it's messy. Like this was not a situation where it's like plug and play, like all good. I don't have to be hands-on anymore. And of course, we've evolved to a place where things are much more steady and certain, but it was not like that when we were trying new things, right? Fourth, I want to talk a tiny bit. This is just a funny story about supporting a special interest. So one of the things about the service dog is that my son refused to help take care of it and often did not want to follow his training, right? So it's like, oh, when doggo does this, we need to correct him in this way. And my son would do the opposite because PDA, right? And so we had to figure out ways to lower the demands and scaffold him, but also knowing that dogs were his special interest, his lifelong love of dogs, and therefore it was regulating to him. So how could we look at the special interest as an entry point to his growth, right? So one of the ideas he had was to earn money by running a business, helping dogs, right? So taking them on walks and feeding them and like, checking in on them if the dog owner was out of town, letting them out to pee, etc. So he and my husband hung up a bunch of signs with my husband's phone number at the dog park here locally. And we joke because what ended up happening was like my husband essentially was running a dog walking business, meaning he was receiving the texts and phone calls, doing all the scheduling. He would go get the dogs and then my son would like play with them for an hour, sometimes even refuse to walk them. So my husband would do it. And then he would take the dog back and communicate with the owner. And often like on Fridays at this point, we were going out on a date and he would have to like go back to the dog's house late at night, like 10 p.m. and let the dog out and pick up their poop. So like it was like 10% my son and 90% my husband, right? But of course my PDA son got all the compensation for it and would say things like, Daddy, I'm doing all of it. You aren't even helping, right? And we would just chuckle because it's like so obvious that my husband's the one actually running this business. But through the PDA lens, this is absolutely worth it because it was a special interest. It was regulating. It was something that would get him out, get him exercise. He felt great self-concept and has experience now with entrepreneurship at a very small level. So like these are the trade-offs we make, but it's not, when I post something on Instagram of like, I remember a couple of years ago, I would try and include some of these anecdotes, but like sometimes I would just post a picture of like my son running his dog business, but behind the scenes, there's a lot more messiness going on, right? Even for me, and still, like to this day. So the final story before we wrap up is when my son was in burnout, one of the things that we had to do was to bounce his body or swing his body for like hours, bounce his body on a trampoline or swing him for hours because it was too much of a demand and his nervous system was in burnout to like pump the swings or jump himself. But he needed the sensory input because he's a sensory seeker. He needed that proprioceptive input to feel where his body was in space. So one of the practices I had was to, after dinner, go out with him on the trampoline with his stuffed doggie, which is, special interest. And we would do things like throw the doggie up in the air and I would bounce his body and he would try and catch it. Or one of the other things we do would I would bounce him and we would talk about transformations of superheroes where he's like, okay, Catwoman and Spider-Man. And then I would be like, Cat Spider. And we would like go back and forth doing this for hours. But one evening, we were jumping on the trampoline and he threw the doggie over the fence of the neighbors, which was very high. We went to the front door and we were knocking on the door kind of frantically, but they weren't home because he needs the dog to sleep. And so he and I like, he started to freak out, and I'm like, we're going to solve the problem. I have some ideas, right? But in my head, I'm like, holy moly, like, what's going to happen? So he and I are dragging the step ladder. We're getting rakes out. Like, we're trying to get like the dog pooper scooper. Like, we are just like trying to hang over this fence and get his doggy. And like, eventually we did. It took a lot of effort and awkwardness. But I remember it fondly as this moment of like, he actually helped me with the rake and the step ladder and the ideas, and we were collaboratively problem solving. And that was one of the first times that he would actually like do that, right? Because even the couple, like 2 years in occupational therapy before that, like, he would have an idea and he wouldn't help bring over the crash pad or help set things up or put them away. It was just like, we had to lower all those demands so he could engage in the occupational therapy. And we solved the problem together, which is like it's a memory that banks in his system, and it's a nervous system regulation of like, mom and I can work together. We solved the problem. It's okay, right? That's like a memory. So I'll stop there with my stories, but I hope these 5 stories help you realize the following: that as you lower demands and start to lower boundaries and view them as more flexible rather than static rules, and you reevaluate the way that you are with your child, it is going to be super messy. Okay, it's going to be messy, it's going to be awkward, you're going to feel anxiety, it's going to be uncertain. And especially for those of you who are more linear or anxious or have access needs around structure and organization, like, this is going to feel exquisitely difficult because it will be messy. That's just the nature of it, because you're going from structure, routine, rewards, consequences, and the control and authority of the parent into, you haven't reached the other paradigm with your child. You're in the middle. And so like, they're learning your new way of being, you're practicing being a different way, and it's going to feel terrifying, right? Because you're like, well, what if this is not actually the right way? And what if, I lower these demands or reduce these limits, and then we never reach an equilibrium, and in fact, it goes the total opposite direction. And like, I'll be honest with you, the vast majority of parents I work with, they get to an equilibrium with the approach that I teach, but that doesn't mean every single person, right? Just like anything, like medications don't work for every single person, therapies don't work for every single person. And so the responsibility, but also freedom of the parents is in the experimentation, right? Because as you start to try things, you confront your own uncertainty and you get to observe without judgment how things are shifting in your relationship and your child's access to basic needs, their nervous system. And what comes with experimentation and trial and error is the knowledge that you can always pivot, right? You can always adjust. It's not a set of rules or a dogma. And there's a lot of agency in that for you as a parent. But as you start to release some of the control in the spirit of experimentation, there's a vulnerability that your child will also sense, because you're moving away from like being the authority who knows everything and is always in control into a more, equal mentorship, like we're just figuring it out together type of energy. And for a PDAer, that is going to produce a sense of felt safety over time, because one of the things that sets off their nervous system is the neuroception around you being above them, okay? And as you grow and observe your child in real time of like, okay, what happens when I do this? Like, how does their body look? Are they screaming less? Like, are they eating more? How's their sleep? And it might get worse before it gets better, in the sense of like, the behavior seems worse and, they're needing to co-sleep or whatever, but you're in that middle period of figuring it out. And if you don't try, if you don't change anything, you will never know You will never get that new data about your child of like, what does work for our family? And how can we figure out a way to have a sustainable, stable, peaceful home environment over the long term? And so, you know, what I teach here and what I provide in the program, the Paradigm Shift program, is structure, language, and the ability to reduce that feeling of chaos, and also with mentors that will tell you it's completely normal. You know, if you're within the first 6 months of doing this, it's going to feel like this. We've walked hundreds and hundreds of families through this process. We've been through it ourselves. But, you know, even if you're in the program, you will feel uncertain. You will feel like it's messy. You will feel scared. And we will give you the tools in order to provide some control and structure to move through it. But we will not be able to eliminate the nature of the experimentation. And that's why we have a group of parents and experts and mentors and guest speakers about the nervous system, so that you can have the support to go through this in a way that's not traumatizing. So that is what I have to say today, and I'm going to take a minute to look through the comments and just see if there are any questions related to this topic of messiness. And if not, we will jump off. Yeah, or timelines, or, you know, sharing the sensation of like, yes, I felt that. I felt like, am I doing it wrong? But I think you can actually look at the messiness as an indicator that you're actually changing things, which is what the game is, right? True change of your behavior, your decisions, and your beliefs underlying them. Okay, what if the child doesn't like to be in the same room when waking up, and then says you're shouting as you're raising your voice to wake them up? So the first thing I would say is, you know, you don't necessarily need to use a voice, right? There's lots of ways we can think creatively about like playing a gentle song, or like slowly turning up the volume, or gently opening the shades, or even, you know, your presence beside them. So I think one of the things we learn as we start to accommodate PDA children is to not just depend on verbal communication, because what we're trying to do is communicate mammal to another human with our nervous system, which actually doesn't have a lot to do with words, right? Or necessarily saying things. I mean, with declarative language, that is one accommodation, but a lot of what I teach doesn't have to do with speaking as much. So those are just some ideas to think about and experiment with. Was he able to attend school, or would he have burned out when going there? He does attend school, yeah, but it's a small, affirming school with lots of autonomy, flexibility, and consent baked into the system, because it's a Montessori school, and they've been accommodating. He also wasn't in burnout anymore when I tried to support him into the school. He wasn't at the point that he was, where I don't think he could have safely been at full-time school, because there was so much fight flight. So it's also like a sequential process, and understanding what your child needs, which part of the process of going through this messiness is like you relearn your child and like what their needs actually are. And this is why my daughter tells me I'm like my new mom. She can feel the energy behind my mind shift. Absolutely. 100%. Yeah, this is why. So when we start practicing accommodations in this messy way, it's our first step, right? And it's okay to do the accommodations even if deep down you're like, I need to be the authority and I'll do this in order to change their behavior, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, for those of you who want to radically shift the relationship and the peace in your home, and by extension, your child's felt safety in the world and level of well-being, it takes an energetic shift and non-attachment behind the accommodation so that you're not applying them as a fix, but rather as an offering, regardless of how they react, regardless of whether they get out of burnout, regardless of whether it changes the behavior. And the paradox is that once we start truly approaching things as an offering with non-attachment and not energetically using things to try and change them or their behavior, that's when things start to shift. It's several months for my son to get used to the collaborative method, but he trusts it now and life is more peaceful. Hooray! I'm so happy. Will it help if the parent has trouble with consistency? I think you're talking about the program. So it depends, right? Like, I can only do my half, right? Like I think I'm a really good match often for ADHDers or people who have trouble with organization, because I provide a lot of structure from a neutral perspective, right? Which people can use to like find safety in their nervous system in order to experiment. However, I can't do anyone else's work, right? So like, for example, we have lots of families, like over 150 families in the Paradigm Shift program. And I always get nervous about like, am I going to be able to answer all the questions the parents have and give them the responses they need to support, along with the coaches I work with, to get them the answers and support they need to make a paradigm shift. But often, basically what I saw from the last cohort is like, if you submitted a question before module 11, there's 12, or not module 11, live, I was able to eventually address you and spot coach you live. But if you aren't able to, like, if you want a question answered and you can't submit it until the very last minute before the very last live, like, I can't guarantee that I'm going to be able to support you in that way. And like, if I'm like, I can't get this question, but please drop it in the moderated community, but the person doesn't do it, there's nothing I can do, right? And so it's like, there has to be a degree of commitment to the learning, right? In order for me to facilitate the support that the person needs live. And, some families go through the program and just use the pre-recorded materials and never show up to live stuff, and that's how they learn. But I think it's an important reflection point for someone to think about, like, can I do my half? Like, can I take responsibility to use some of the materials in the way that I think will help me, rather than putting all the responsibility on the program for implementation, right? And that's just my very honest answer, because deep in my heart, like, I want everybody to succeed and I want everybody to get the most out of the program, but I also don't take responsibility for other people's actions, right? So I hope that's enough information to decide for you. But yeah, can you do this for a 13-year-old? Of course, yeah. I'm so glad it's helpful. Is there a time when the child grows a little more out of these behaviors or it changes? So yes and no, right? So like, a PDA brain does not become not PDA, which means there's a sensitive threat response. Anytime there's a perception of a loss of control, that there's not autonomy, freedom, and choice, and or something is putting themselves above them in a position of authority, it will tell the PDA nervous system, hey, you're in danger or you're in mortal threat. Go into the physiological and metabolic process of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse. Okay, so they're not going to grow out of that. what will happen is that they will have cognitive development, and if we can get them from operating mostly from the survival brain to the thinking brain with accommodations over time, they can actually learn and develop. But if you have a child who's just always in the survival brain because we're responding to them with like behavioral modification and traditional parenting and ABA and public school, then they're not going to grow out of it. They might start to internalize it. They might have like a survival response to like, oh, I cannot change. My amygdala knows I am in an inescapable situation where no matter what I do, I'm going to continue to get these nervous system activations. And therefore, the safest thing for my nervous system and my body is going to be to internalize. But that means maybe we don't see it on the outside, but it's still going on, right? There's still adrenaline, there's still cortisol, and it's going to impact their basic needs. And so I want to be very clear that they don't grow out of this. And for a lot of families I've worked with who have tweens and teens who have complied until they reach a pretty significant burnout, it's a much harder row to hoe, because instead of 6 to 7 years of relearning and reestablishing a relationship and a way of being, they've got 14 years, right? And so there's more to relearn together. And it can also, for the internalized expressions, really take parents by surprise, because the kid seems fine and compliant, and then all of a sudden they can't leave their room, they can't eat, there's self-harm, and they don't go to school. I don't say that to scare you. I just want to give you the truth so that you're not thinking like, they'll grow out of it. And I remember doctors and pediatricians saying like, they'll grow out of it, or they need the skills, they'll get the skills. And it just didn't happen. It just kept getting worse and worse. Of course, as I'm saying this, like, trust your intuition. If you're like, yeah, something deep inside me knows that that's not true for my child, then of course, trust yourself. Like, I don't know your child or your situation more than you do ever. But I can tell you about patterns in a large sample of families, and I will say that they don't grow out of being PDA. The behaviors might change, but what's going on inside the body won't. And so it can come out unexpectedly because it's accumulating over time. So the purpose of what we're learning here is to accommodate the nervous system so they're not always in the survival brain, and they can learn and develop and grow and connect and access empathy and skills that they already have. And if they don't, they can start to learn from a space of not being in the part of the brain where we can't learn. Okay, so I hope that is helpful. So how do we get a diagnosis for PDA? It depends on where you are, and you're probably going to have to advocate for it using the language of the DSM adapted for PDA. So two starting points. One, take a look at the DSM and think about how restricted and repetitive interests apply to your child. So you need to frame it for the pediatrician or neuropsych. Like, it might be a social special interest. It might be another kid. It might be rotating, but it's still the logic that we can use to communicate. And then the social communication differences, you're going to want to frame that as well. The second thing I would say is PDA North America has a really good, at least in Canada and the United States, list of PDA affirming practitioners that you can access using the link in my bio as a starting point, and then reach out in your geographic area to someone who will be at least aware of PDA. And then the third suggestion I have for you is, if you can't find that geographically, look for potentially in private practice. And I know this is like more expensive, but it might be the opening for you to access more funding and insurance and advocacy. And that would be looking for a practitioner who is trauma informed, neurodiversity affirming, maybe LGBTQIA plus affirming, female expression affirming, because all of those somewhat indicate operating outside of the status quo of like, this is what an autistic boy looks like, right? And so if we can find people who have already stepped outside of that very like traditional way of viewing things, it can indicate that they might be more receptive to learning about your child. So I hope those three tips help you. I feel like she manipulates me sometimes. What is PDA talking and what is the teen? So I want to validate that like our kids are still kids. They're going to push boundaries. Teens are still going to be teens. However, in order to really make a big shift in your family, what you want to experiment with, if you feel like you want to, is to view it all through the PDA lens and see what shifts. Because if you're trying to discern, you're going to drive yourself nuts. And the paradigm shift is viewing it all through the PDA lens as an experiment to see what changes. I'm curious how the program might help when you have a counterparent that never sees the behaviors and blames my parenting for all the struggles. He will never get on board with support, I think. Okay, so there's a couple things there. Like, the spirit of the program and my business is never to like try and control other people's behaviors, emotions, opinions of me, the business, PDA, etc. All the strategies that we're learning, including advocacy in the program, are really based on what we can control and what we can do without trying to control others, right? Which is a real shift from how a lot of advocacy is, but this is the way I've found things to be most effective for families, including my own. So, sometimes, not always, the non-lead parent, the person who is not in the trenches all the time with the PDAer, will go at a different pace. They get their own login. They have their own autonomy. They can engage or not. They have their own unique login. And sometimes I hear stories where it's like the partner did not engage the entire time, but then 6 months later, they like finally listened to the program on the podcast and like started to shift things. Sometimes they don't. And then sometimes having the program as a common language, a common framework in a linear, research-based, more academic fashion for certain parents who aren't on board can really support them to get there. Because for some reason or another, and I might have been like this more too, there needs to be a way things are communicated that is less emotional, right? And unfortunately, like when a spouse or a partner communicates to another partner, it lands differently. And then the other thing is you get 2 unique logins with the program in your household, but household can be flexible, right? So if you have a grandparent that wants to take it as your support, or if you have a caregiver who you're trying to train, they can support you as the other member of your household. And so, I find that modeling how we want to be in the world and doing the things through our behavior is often more powerfully changing of others than trying to change them, right? And I would say a lot of parents are undiagnosed neurodivergent themselves, and they're going to have a lot more resistance, right? Especially if they're undiagnosed PDA themselves or autistic. It's just going to take more time, and it requires a lot of work on oneself and openness and vulnerability to make these changes. And so we can never force another person to get there, right? But we can do what we can do. And by extension, sometimes it ripples out into the world and shifts others, and sometimes it doesn't. But that's not something that I can guarantee either way. I can only talk about what we provide. We also have, my husband does 3 live non-lead parent sessions, which are usually dads. And he does that support in a circle in our moderated community. So it's also like an opportunity to connect with other parents, often dads, who are not in the trenches in the same way, and that for some can be really supportive. So we do have infrastructure in the program to support that, but whether or not it shifts your your partner's timeline or approach or beliefs, like that's not under our control, right? But I hope it's supportive. I hope it helps. How old is too old? So I'm interpreting that question as general. So I'm going to say never. Like, I've worked with families who have adult children, in their late 20s, early 30s. The program is much more designed around 3 to 18-year-olds. But every cohort, we have a small sample of parents whose PDA children are in their 20s. It introduces different constraints and different dynamics, and it's not going to be as easy as trying to shift this when your child is 5. But I believe it's never too late to change a relationship. Or connection or trust between two humans, which is really at the core of what we're doing here. Do I have to be part of the program to access the private community? Yeah, the private community is moderated by me and 2 other coaches for 3 months, and it's only for the program participants because they're all working together to practice the tools. And it's not on Facebook, it's in our web platform, so it's a different private moderated space so that we can really support the families in their learning. And it's not a support group. It's like implementing things, and we support you through that change. Okay, is the program more tailored to younger kids? As a mom of PDA teen, I wonder if it will still be relevant. Our issues are very tricky with an older child. Okay, so I would say it's slightly organized. Okay, so all the tools, all the skills that you're learning, the sacred pause, cost-benefit decision-making, the 12 most effective accommodations, nonviolent communication, using the Plato framework, boundaries, like all of those skills and the logic and the concepts apply to any age, right? But the examples and the participants may be slightly skewed towards 3 to 11-year-olds. However, we do have a fairly large contingent of parents of teens, and we have a coach specifically who has raised 2 adult PDAers herself, now 20 and 26, who works specifically in the moderated community with the teen circle so that you can also connect with each other. And then we have a special session on teens, and for most of like the accommodations, I'll give an example of a younger child, and usually my own, and then I'll give an anonymized example from a tween teen from my coaching work or other work with families. So, and then we do have a couple PDFs that are like applying concepts like play to an older person where it's more playful rather than like role play, right? So that's the information I can give you to answer your question of whether or not this is the right fit for you. Is intermittent explosive disorder and PDA the same? So I'm not a clinician, so I can't like say clinically or diagnostic wise if they're exactly the same. I haven't looked in the DSM-5 at that particular disorder. I do think it can often be misdiagnosed. So like anecdotally, I will tell you that there's often a subset of parents whose children have like ODD DMDD, like dysregulated mood disorder, something, intermittent explosive disorder, or reactive attachment syndrome, that like sort of subset of like defiant oppositional acronyms and diagnoses, and then they realize that it's actually PDA. So something to think about is, if you haven't, watching our free Clarity Masterclass in the link in our bio, because it will outline the 5 characteristics to look for. But the other thing I would say is like understanding the logic of what's causing the behavior. So is it the moments that the child is perceiving you're above them, that they don't have freedom and choice, and or that they don't have control? What happens when there's a limit? Is it equalizing, like controlling you, manipulating you, like directed specifically at you, versus just more explosiveness? And then importantly, PDA is a nervous system disability that over time impacts the ability to access basic needs like toileting, hygiene, sleep, safety, and eating. And so often that causal relationship is not looked at. But if we look at these kids, with toileting, they might use a diaper at the age of 8, or only poop in the backyard, or they can't go through potty training, or they have encopresis, or they have UTIs from withholding, or they have accidents past the developmental age that would be typical, right? In per quotations. And so often medical professionals look at that as a separate issue. So like your child might have an intermittent explosive disorder diagnosed, but then they also have these medical issues that are actually related to the nervous system and PDA, but they're looked at as separate, right? When it's actually this continual nervous system activation that is like causing the child not to be able to sleep unless they're sleeping next to you all night, or where they're moving into a non-24-hour sleep cycle, or they're like constantly eating or restricting eating to the point where you're concerned about nutrition and calories. So basic needs is the place I would really focus to like interrogate this question and look at the Clarity Masterclass if it feels supportive. In your experience, could a pediatrician provide a suspected ASD? I'm not sure I understand that question. What about PDA, or a kid with PDA flavors and OCD? When you accommodate, when you don't. Are you supposed to identify and try and separate the OCD? Is this discussed in detail in the program? So in the pre-recorded content, there is one lesson on distinguishing the two, but the purpose of the program is to experiment consistently through only the PDA lens, to isolate that particular thing so that at the end of 3 months you can see what shifts and what doesn't. So it gives you much more clarity on like, is this OCD or is this PDA, right? Because often what I've experienced with parents in the program or in my coaching is that the OCD-like behaviors actually reduce when we take a PDA approach, because the controlling was coming from nervous system activation and needing to equalize to get back into a place of safety. However, I don't know if that's going to be the case. It's only the parent who goes through the program, and then at the end of 3 months they can see like, oh yeah, they're definitely PDA, this is what helped. However, they still have these OCD-like behaviors. So for these, we're going to use more exposure or a different approach with a professional in that realm, right? So I can definitely think of like at least 4 spot coaching sessions where I in-depth went through this question with examples with the parent in their home in previous cohorts, and all of those interactions are anonymized and placed into a searchable private podcast, so you can listen to all the OCD content even if it's not baked into the pre-recorded program, because it's more based on like what the parents were actually wanting to work through. So there certainly is that question, of course, right? And parents whose children who have OCD and PDA. There's also parents who are concerned that they don't know which one it is, right? And what I'm going to teach you is how to gain clarity on that question through your experimentation and trying out a different lens and then seeing what shifts. Okay? So I'm not like here to give you advice or solutions. I'm teaching you the skills you need in order to get clarity on your child, which relates to this question, to make decisions, to accommodate, to track indicators so that you know if they're doing better, and to advocate for what you think is best, right? So like what you end up doing is going to be different than me and different than other people in the program, because that's the point, right? You're finding your agency and empowerment and understanding your child for like anew. And that's what I want for you. I want you to find freedom within the constraints of your life. Okay, I'm going to answer one more question because I have a meeting. Sorry, guys. In your experience, could a pediatrician provide a doc about a suspected ASD PDA diagnosis that we could share with a private school in order to withdraw her for this fall? Full neuropsych 2 years ago missed the diagnosis, in your opinion. So I think you can always go get a second opinion, right? It might cost you if you have to go to a private practitioner. Like we had to do both a private psychologist and then, because there was such a long wait list, we got a second ASD diagnosis at the University of Michigan, right? But in the interim, we had a private pediatrician who could support us in understanding my son's brain, which was accessible much more quickly. So, you know, as I said to someone else on this call, like I would take a look at PDA North America's list of PDA affirming practitioners and see if there's someone in your geographic area. And even if it's not a pediatrician or someone who can diagnose, reaching out to them and asking them who in the geographic area would be the best support for you. So the way that PDA is diagnosed is still using the DSM-5, which is an ASD diagnosis. And then often there's a descriptor written in with PDA tendencies or a PDA profile or demand avoidant tendencies. So, you know, I don't know of anyone who like diagnoses PDA as a standalone completely, at least in the United States, because it doesn't click with, you know, the medical system and the insurance system. Like there isn't a category. So it's a subcategory of ASD, which is in the DSM-5. All right, my friends, I'm jumping off. It was nice to speak with you.